The endless blackness of space stretched far beyond the reach of anyone's imagination. Stars twinkled in the distance, and planets orbited around them, unaware of the danger lurking in the void. It was a quiet, peaceful corner of the galaxy, where few ships traveled and fewer still dared to explore. Yet even in this remote region, something unusual was happening. A sudden, sharp signal pierced through the silence. A distress signal. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it repeated again and again, growing stronger as if calling for help. The signal was short, sharp, and desperate, but it didn't match anything anyone had ever heard before. It wasn't like the usual distress calls sent by civilian ships or exploratory teams. This one was different. This one carried a strange urgency, a sense of fear that couldn't be ignored. The crew of the Vanguard were the first to pick it up. They were a small, isolated research ship, barely equipped to handle anything out of the ordinary. The ship's sensors had just finished scanning a nearby asteroid belt when the signal crackled through their comm system. It wasn't supposed to be there. "Captain, you need to hear this," the communications officer said, his voice tight with uncertainty. He had heard a lot of strange things in his years aboard the Vanguard, but this one felt off. Captain Ava Harris walked over to the console, her boots clicking against the metal floor. She looked at the blinking red light on the monitor, a distress signal originating from deep within an uncharted sector of space, over 100 light-years away. She couldn't remember the last time they passed through that region. It was a part of space that even the most daring explorers avoided. Too many disappearances, too many strange occurrences. It was almost as if the galaxy itself wanted to keep it a secret. "Play it again," Captain Harris ordered, crossing her arms, her brow furrowed in thought. The officer tapped a few buttons, and the signal repeated. The voice that came through was distorted, rough, like it had been sent through a broken comm system. It was almost impossible to understand at first, but there were a few words that were clear enough to hear. "Help. Deathworlders. Too many." Harris leaned in closer, trying to catch every word. Deathworlders. The word sent a chill down her spine. Deathworlders were a term used in whispers. Most stories about them were filled with terror. They were the kind of beings who had evolved on planets so hostile, so deadly, that they were virtually unstoppable. Their mere presence was enough to bring fear to entire civilizations. No one dared to cross them, and no one had ever made contact with them. "Who is sending this?" Harris muttered under her breath. "Unknown," the communications officer replied, his voice tinged with fear. "It's coming from a planet, one that doesn't even show up on any of our charts." Ava's heart began to race. A planet that wasn't on the maps. That was strange, even for this part of the galaxy. The galaxy was vast, but every inhabited world was cataloged by the space agencies. No planet should have slipped through the cracks. At least, not in this day and age. "Run a deep scan. Find anything that can give us more information," Captain Harris commanded. The officer quickly typed away, his fingers flying over the console. The ship's scanners whirred to life, sending pulses of energy out to probe the space around them. Seconds turned into minutes, and still, the signal remained unclear. They couldn't pinpoint the exact source. But then suddenly, the scan returned a result, an anomaly. "There's something out there," the officer said, his voice trembling. "It's not just the signal. There's a fleet, a massive fleet, moving in our direction." Harris stiffened. A fleet. Out here, the signal didn't make sense. The Deathworlders had no known fleets. At least, none that anyone knew of. Why would they send a distress call? And why would they be heading toward the Vanguard? The captain's mind raced. Was this a trap? Was someone trying to lure them into a dangerous situation? Or could this really be a plea for help? "Set a course to the source of the signal," Harris ordered. Her voice was calm, but her hands clenched tightly at her sides. "And make sure we're ready for anything. Prepare the shields and activate defensive systems." The crew didn't need to be told twice. Everyone aboard the Vanguard was aware that something was wrong. The tension was palpable, the quiet hum of the ship filling the air as the crew scrambled to prepare for whatever lay ahead. In the distant reaches of space, a warning had been sent. The Vanguard was heading directly toward it, unaware of the true danger waiting in the darkness. Minutes passed, and the tension grew thicker. The signal was still coming through, weaker now, but persistent. It was like a lifeline being thrown into the void, a desperate plea for help. And yet, something about it felt off. The voice was too calm, the message too calculated. Who was sending this? Why weren't they frightened? As the ship neared the source, the crew could see it on their sensors, a small dark planet, barely visible in the distance. It didn't look like much. No life signs, no communication, just a dead rock orbiting a dying star. And yet, something about it felt alive. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The crew braced themselves for what was to come. Whatever was happening on that planet, it was no ordinary distress signal. Something far worse was waiting. Captain Harris felt a shiver run down her spine as the Vanguard glided closer to the planet, the strange signal growing louder in her ears. She didn't know who was sending the message, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever lay ahead, they were not prepared for it. This section sets the stage for your story, creating suspense and intrigue, while using simple English and a straightforward third-person narrative style. It sets up questions that will keep the audience hooked. Who is sending the signal? Why is the fleet moving? And most importantly, what is waiting for them on the distant planet? The Vanguard moved closer to the unknown planet, its engines humming softly as the crew prepared for what might lie ahead. Captain Harris stood at the front of the bridge, staring at the flickering screen that showed the planet growing larger in the distance. It still looked like a lifeless rock, but the strange signal was still pulsing, almost urging them to come closer. "Captain," the communications officer spoke up, his voice low. "The signal's getting stronger. It's like it's pulling us in." Harris nodded, but the unease in her gut wouldn't fade. The planet shouldn't be there. No records, no life signs. It didn't make sense. "Keep scanning," Harris ordered, her eyes not leaving the planet. "I need to know everything about this place before we get any closer." The crew was on edge. They had faced strange situations before, but nothing like this. The Vanguard was a research ship, not a combat vessel. Their mission was simple: gather data, explore, and report. This was different. This was something they weren't prepared for. The officer working the sensors was visibly nervous. His hand shook slightly as he adjusted the controls. "Captain, there's something else. Something big. Very big." Harris turned toward him, narrowing her eyes. "What do you mean?" "There's a fleet," the officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A huge fleet. It's moving in our direction. And they're not hiding their presence. They're coming straight for us." A cold chill ran through Harris. A fleet. A massive fleet. She knew the Vanguard wasn't built for a battle. They had no weapons to defend themselves. But the question that lingered in her mind was, who would be sending a fleet here? And why? "Are you sure?" Harris asked, her voice calm but with an edge of urgency. The officer nodded, his face pale. "It's coming fast. It's huge. Way too large to be just a few ships. It's like an entire armada." "Captain, who are they?" she asked, her mind racing. The officer hesitated before answering. "I don't know. There's no identification, no sign of any known species. But they're using a communication frequency. I've never seen anything like it before." Harris's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary fleet. This wasn't some group of traders or explorers. This was something far more dangerous. She walked over to the tactical officer, her boots clicking on the metal floor. "Can you track them?" The officer quickly worked his controls. "They're still too far out for precise tracking. But they're closing in. And they're not slowing down." The ship was now within range of the planet. The crew could see its barren surface more clearly, but the closer they got, the more the tension in the air grew. The signal had gone silent for a few moments, and now it was back, louder than before. "Something's not right," Captain Harris muttered to herself. Just as the thought crossed her mind, the comms officer spoke up again, his voice tense. "Captain, the fleet, it's broadcasting a message. It's in a language I can barely translate, but it's directed at us. They know we're here." The words Deathworlders began to echo in Harris's mind. The stories, the rumors, they were the stuff of nightmares. The Deathworlders were a terrifying legend, a race so fierce, so deadly, that no one dared to even approach their home systems. No one had ever seen them up close, and no one knew why they were so feared. All they knew was that crossing paths with them meant certain destruction. "Put it through," Harris said, her voice steady, but with a slight tremor that she couldn't hide. The officer tapped a few keys, and suddenly the bridge was filled with a harsh, crackling sound. The language was alien, deep and guttural, a mix of noises that felt foreign to every ear aboard the ship. But there was no mistaking the intent in the message. It was hostile. Harris's eyes widened. This was no mistake. The Deathworlders were real, and they were coming for them. "Captain," the officer spoke, his voice trembling. "I've managed to get a rough translation. It's a warning, but also a threat. They're telling us to leave. Now." A chill ran down her spine. "What do they want from us?" The officer looked confused. "I'm not sure. The message is unclear, but one word keeps repeating. Revenge. Revenge." Harris echoed, her heart racing. Revenge for what? But before anyone could answer, the entire ship suddenly shook with a violent jolt. The Vanguard was rocked by a wave of energy that rattled every panel, every surface. The crew scrambled to hold onto something solid as alarms blared across the bridge. What was that? Someone shouted, "Shields up!" "Now!" Captain Harris barked, her voice commanding. The tactical officer quickly hit a series of buttons, activating the Vanguard's shield systems. The ship stabilized, but the tension was still unbearable. The shaking stopped, but the feeling of danger was real now. "They're getting closer," the sensor officer reported. "We're locked on. They're targeting us." "Captain, we're not equipped to fight back," the weapons officer said. "We don't have the firepower to stand up against something like this." "I know," Harris replied, her mind working furiously. They were a small research ship with no weapons designed to fight anything this powerful. "But we can't run now. We have to find out what's going on. We have no choice but to face them." The silence on the bridge was deafening. Every crew member knew that the situation was growing worse by the second. The Deathworlder fleet was real, and it was closing in. The Vanguard was just a tiny speck in the vastness of space, and they were about to face a storm unlike anything they had ever imagined. In Part 2, the tension continues to rise as the crew realizes they are facing the legendary Deathworlder fleet, and their fate is hanging in the balance. The suspense builds as the fleet moves closer, and the unknown motives of the Deathworlders leave the crew on edge, setting up for the next part of the story. The Vanguard floated in the cold void of space, its crew staring at the enormous fleet of Deathworlder ships approaching fast. Captain Harris stood at the front of the bridge, her fists clenched as she watched the massive vessels draw closer on the radar. Her mind raced with questions, but there were no easy answers. Who had sent the SOS? Why were the Deathworlders coming? What was the true meaning behind this sudden threat? "Captain," the communications officer said, breaking the tense silence. "We've been able to translate more of the Deathworlder message. It's not what we expected." Harris turned to face him. "What do you mean?" The officer hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's a plea for help, Captain, not a threat. They're begging for our assistance. The fleet, the Deathworlders, they're not here to attack us. They're here because they need our help." Captain Harris blinked in shock. A plea for help. This didn't make any sense. The Deathworlders were a legendary species, known for their terrifying strength and ruthless nature. They didn't need anyone's help. They were the ones who were feared, not the ones who asked for mercy. What happened? Harris asked, her voice low. Why would the Deathworlders need our help? They're a force we can barely comprehend. There's no way they could be in trouble. The officer worked quickly, translating more of the message as he went. It's a matter of survival. They're not just asking for assistance. They're warning us. Something happened to their homeworld. Something that's threatening to wipe them out. A cold shiver ran down Harris's spine. The Deathworlders were known to come from worlds so hostile, so dangerous, that any other species would have perished long ago. If they were in danger, then the threat must be unimaginable. Tell me more, Harris ordered, her voice tight. What happened? The officer continued to read from the message, his eyes scanning quickly. They were betrayed, Captain. Their homeworld was destroyed by someone they once trusted, someone they thought was an ally. It wasn't a natural disaster, Captain. It was a war. The Deathworlders were caught off guard, and their entire world was torn apart by their enemies. They're the last survivors, and they've been searching for help ever since. Betrayed, Harris echoed. By who? The officer paused, then continued. It's not entirely clear. The message is fragmented, but they keep mentioning a species that's unfamiliar to us. The Ancients. They're the ones who did this. It seems they'd wiped out the Deathworlders' homeworld, and now the Deathworlders are seeking revenge. The word Ancients sent a chill through Harris. She'd heard rumors, old stories, but nothing that could be confirmed. The Ancients were said to be a race of incredibly advanced beings, almost godlike in their powers. They had vanished from history, their civilization long forgotten. No one knew if they still existed or if they had left any traces behind. And now, they were involved in the destruction of the Deathworlders' planet. How do we know they're telling the truth? Harris asked, trying to keep her mind focused. For all we know, this could be a trap. They could be trying to manipulate us. The officer looked troubled. I don't know, Captain, but they keep insisting that they need our help. They're not attacking. In fact, they've pulled back their fleet slightly. They're waiting for us to respond. There's one thing in the message that keeps repeating. Only you can stop them. Only us. Harris whispered. This was too much to process. The Vanguard was a research ship, not a military vessel. The crew had no experience in dealing with massive galactic wars or ancient enemies. They were trained to study, to observe, but never to fight. Could this really be real? Harris thought. Could the Deathworlders, the fiercest warriors in the galaxy, really need help from a crew like ours? Captain, the tactical officer spoke, interrupting her thoughts. We're being hailed. The Deathworlder fleet is trying to communicate directly with us. Harris took a deep breath and nodded. Put it through. The screen flickered, and a figure appeared, tall, armored, and covered in intricate designs that seemed to shimmer with dark energy. The figure's face was hidden behind a mask, but the voice was unmistakable, deep, commanding, and full of urgency. This is Captain Zoreth of the Deathworlder fleet. We have come to you in desperation. The Ancients have returned. They have destroyed our home. Our people are dying, and we have nowhere to turn. You must help us, or we will be wiped from existence. Your species is the key to stopping them. You must act now. Harris stared at the screen, trying to process the gravity of the situation. Zoreth's voice was filled with such raw emotion, something she had never expected from the Deathworlders. They had always been cold, merciless warriors in the stories. But now she saw something else in Zoreth's eyes. Desperation. Fear. A species on the edge of extinction. Why us? Harris asked, her voice steady but filled with doubt. Why would you think we can help? Zoreth's gaze hardened. Because you are human. Your species has something that we have lost. Something we need to survive. Only you have the strength and resolve to defeat the Ancients. The words hit Harris like a wave. She had no idea what this strength was that Zorath spoke of. All she knew was that the Deathworlders were asking for help, and if they didn't act fast, the galaxy could lose one of its most powerful species. "I will need time to think," Harris said, trying to gather her thoughts. "We need to decide if we can trust you." Zorath gave a small, sad nod. "I understand. But know this, Captain. If you do not help us, all will be lost. We have already lost everything." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge silent. The crew exchanged worried glances, each one feeling the weight of the decision ahead. This was no longer just about survival. This was about saving a species on the brink of annihilation. Captain Harris knew the decision was now in her hands. Help the Deathworlders, or leave them to their fate. Either way, the Vanguard was about to be drawn into a war that could change the galaxy forever. The atmosphere on the Vanguard was heavy with tension. The crew had gathered in the briefing room, each member silently processing the words they had just heard from the Deathworlder captain, Zorath. The weight of the decision was nearly unbearable. Help the Deathworlders, or walk away. Every crew member had their own doubts, but Captain Harris knew that the decision wasn't just about the Vanguard's survival anymore. It was about something far larger. "Captain," the science officer, Dr. Lan, spoke up, her voice cautious but firm. "We've run the scans. There's something very strange about this message. It's not just about the fleet and their destruction. There's something more. Something older. The ancients they're talking about, could they be related to the civilization we found before? The one that left behind the ruins in the Hathor Nebula?" Harris turned her attention to Dr. Lyon, the science officer's words striking a chord. The Hathor Nebula was one of the most mysterious areas of space. It was littered with ancient ruins, strange technologies, and forgotten knowledge. Some scientists believe that the ancients, whoever they were, might have once had a presence there. But until now, no one had ever uncovered proof. I don't know," Harris answered honestly. "But I know one thing. If what Zorath said is true, if the ancients really are back, then the Deathworlders are in real danger. And if they are telling the truth, we might be the only ones who can stop them." There was a long silence. The crew looked to each other, unsure of how to proceed. Captain Harris could feel the weight of their uncertain eyes on her. But they all knew, deep down, that there was no easy choice. The Vanguard wasn't built for war. Yet it wasn't a research vessel anymore. It had become something else entirely. The lifeline. A symbol of hope, or perhaps of doom. "I want full analysis of the fleet's movements," Harris said, her voice steady. "We need to know what we're dealing with. If we're going to help them, we need to be sure. If there's any way to stop the ancients from destroying everything, we have to find it." The crew quickly began working, the hum of machinery and the tapping of keyboards filling the air. The ship's scanners were already in overdrive, analyzing the fleet's position, energy levels, and any sign of hidden weapons or defenses. After a few minutes, the tactical officer spoke up. "Captain, the Deathworlder fleet is moving again. It looks like they're setting up an intercept course with something, or someone. We're still too far to get a clear read, but it doesn't look good. They've powered up their weapons. It's like they're preparing for a battle." Harris's stomach sank. "They're not planning to fight us, are they?" "No," the officer replied, shaking his head. "Not us. It looks like they're targeting a larger fleet. Something massive. And the readings are off the charts. This isn't just any fleet, Captain. This is something different. Something older." The hair on the back of Harris's neck stood up. "The ancients?" she asked, but her voice was more of a question than a statement. The officer nodded gravely. "It could be. It's the only explanation. The readings, they don't match anything we've ever seen before." Harris felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders. The ancients were not just an old myth. They were real, and they were coming. The Vanguard was in uncharted territory now. They had no weapons, no way of defending themselves against the unknown power of the ancients or their terrifying fleet. And yet, they had no choice. The Deathworlders had begged for help, and the Vanguard was the only ship close enough to answer. As the crew worked furiously to analyze the situation, Harris sat in her chair, lost in thought. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to come together, but the picture they were revealing was far darker than she had imagined. The ancients, they're not just powerful, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. They're ancient. They'd been hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right time to strike. And now, they're back. But why? Why come now? The comms officer interrupted her thoughts. Captain, we're receiving another message. It's from the Deathworlder fleet. Harris's heart raced. The last message had been urgent and desperate. What could they possibly say now? Put it through, Harris said, trying to sound calm, though the dread in her gut was growing. The screen flickered again, and Captain Zoreth appeared, his armored face grim, his voice filled with pain. Captain Harris. Zoreth's voice was tight with emotion. The ancients are not just enemies. They are gods to us. Long ago, they taught our ancestors the ways of war, and then they left us to fend for ourselves. We thought we were strong enough to survive without them, but we were wrong. Now, they've returned, and they have come for revenge. They seek to erase us from the galaxy. They will stop at nothing. Harris's pulse quickened as she listened, the weight of Zoreth's words sinking in. These weren't just ancient enemies. They were beings of unimaginable power, capable of wiping entire species from existence. And now, after centuries of silence, they had returned. And they had set their sights on the Deathworlders. They will destroy us, Captain. They will destroy everything in their path. The only way to stop them is to destroy their source of power, their homeworld, their heart. Zoreth's words hung in the air like a cold shadow. The Deathworlders' greatest enemies had returned, and they were more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. But there was still one question left. Where was their homeworld? And how could they reach it? Where is this heart? Harris asked, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her. Zoreth's gaze hardened. It is hidden, Captain, but we know its location. If you are willing to help us, we will lead you there. But be warned, getting there will not be easy. The ancients will do everything to stop us. Harris took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. The choice had been made. She had to help. The Vanguard had to help the Deathworlders, or the galaxy would fall into chaos. Prepare for the jump, Harris ordered, her voice sharp. Set course for the heart of the ancients. It's time we put an end to this. The Vanguard hummed as it prepared to jump into hyperspace, the distant stars stretching into streaks of light outside the ship's viewports. Captain Harris stood at the command center, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair. The crew was silent, all of them knowing that what they were about to do could be the last decision they ever made. They were heading into the heart of the ancients, the very source of the power that could destroy everything. Ready, Captain, the tactical officer called out. All systems are green. We're set to jump. Harris took a deep breath. She had never felt more uncertain about anything in her life. They were no longer just scientists, no longer explorers. They were about to venture into the unknown, risking everything to stop the ancients from wiping out an entire species, and possibly the entire galaxy. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, but she had no choice. The Deathworlders had trusted them. They had to trust themselves now. Make the jump, Harris ordered, her voice steady but with an edge of urgency. The ship's engines roared to life, and with a sudden shift, the Vanguard shot forward, the stars blurring into streaks as they entered hyperspace. The crew braced themselves as the jump took them further than they had ever gone before. No one knew what awaited them on the other side. All they could do was follow the coordinates Zoreth had given them, hoping it was enough. As the ship traveled through hyperspace, Harris turned to the view screen, her eyes scanning the void. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them. The thought was unsettling, but there was no time for doubt now. They were committed. They had to trust their course. Hours passed. The tension aboard the ship was unbearable. The crew was working tirelessly, monitoring their systems, running calculations, and keeping their eyes on the approaching destination. No one spoke much. Each person was lost in their own thoughts, wondering what awaited them at the end of this journey. Finally, the ship began to slow. The stars outside the viewport began to return to their usual form, no longer streaking past in a blur. The jump was complete. "We're approaching the coordinates, Captain," the sensor officer said, his voice tense. "I'm detecting something. Something large. Very large." "Can you get a better scan?" Harris asked, her heart racing. The officer worked quickly, running multiple scans. The results were overwhelming. "Captain, it's a massive structure. It's a city. No, it's more than that. It's a fortress, a ship, a planet-sized ship maybe. I'm detecting energy readings that are off the scale. This is not just any ship. It's the Ancients' heart. A fortress that big could only mean one thing. This was their homeworld, the source of the Ancients' power. The crew could feel the weight of the moment. They had arrived. Harris took a deep breath, her mind racing. They were standing at the edge of something much bigger than they had imagined. "Prepare to approach," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Get us close, but be ready for anything. I don't trust this place." The Vanguard began to drift toward the massive structure. It was like a planet and a ship combined, a hulking metallic fortress that dwarfed their vessel. The size of it was impossible to comprehend, stretching far beyond the viewports. The energy readings were unsettling, like a living thing, breathing in the darkness of space. As they drew nearer, the Vanguard systems suddenly began to glitch. The lights flickered, and a low hum filled the air. The ship shook as if something powerful was reaching out to them. "Captain, I don't like this," the tactical officer said, his voice shaky. "We're being pulled in. Something's interfering with our engines." Harris's grip tightened. The Ancients had been waiting for them. This wasn't just a coincidence. They had known they would come. "Hold course," Harris ordered, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. "Stay focused. We need to know everything about this place." But the ship was moving of its own accord now. The massive energy readings from the fortress were overwhelming, and the Vanguard was being drawn closer against the crew's will. "Captain," the communications officer shouted, "we're receiving a transmission, but it's not from the Deathworlders." The screen flickered and suddenly came to life. This time, it wasn't Zoreth. The figure on the screen was different, a being of pure energy, its form shifting and rippling, its voice a deep, resonating echo that filled the entire bridge. "Welcome, Captain Harris," the voice boomed. "I have been expecting you." Harris froze, her eyes wide with shock. This wasn't just a transmission. This was an invitation, or perhaps a warning. "We are the Ancients," the voice continued, "and we have watched your species for eons. You are but children compared to us, but your potential, your strength, it has awakened something in us, and now you will understand why you were chosen." The words hit Harris like a wave, and she struggled to find her voice. "Why us? Why did you send the Deathworlders to us?" The being's form shifted again, its shape becoming clearer, though its appearance was still difficult to grasp. "Because you are the key to our salvation, or our destruction. You are human. You have the power to either destroy us or awaken what we have hidden for millennia. The Deathworlders sought us out because they could not stand alone. They needed someone strong enough to face what we have become." The ship groaned as it was drawn closer, the fortress looming ever larger before them. Harris's heart was pounding in her chest. "What do you want from us?" Harris demanded. She knew that every word could be the difference between life and death for her crew, and for the galaxy. The being's voice was calm, but there was a dark promise beneath it. You will help us reclaim what we have lost, or you will witness the end of everything. The choice is yours. Before she could respond, the transmission ended, and the fortress seemed to pulse with dark energy. The Vanguard was now inside the fortress's gravitational pull, moving deeper into the heart of the Ancient's power. The crew was silent, but Captain Harris could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The future of the Deathworlders, her crew, and possibly the entire galaxy now rested on what they did next. Prepare for whatever comes next, Harris said quietly, but with unwavering resolve. This is not just a battle for survival. This is a battle for everything. The atmosphere aboard the Vanguard was suffocating. The massive fortress of the Ancients loomed before them, a dark and terrifying presence that seemed to reach out with invisible hands, pulling the ship closer and closer to its core. The crew could feel it, the weight of the decision they now faced. Every eye in the command center was fixed on the viewports, their gazes locked on the rippling figure of the being that had just communicated with them. The voice of the Ancients still echoed in their minds, a chilling promise that no one dared ignore. We have to make a choice, Captain Harris murmured under her breath. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the armrests of her chair, eyes never leaving the fortress that grew ever closer. The tension on the bridge was unbearable. Everyone knew it. This was no longer a mission of discovery. This was a mission for survival. They said we're the key, Captain. The communications officer spoke up, his voice trembling. The Ancients said we had the power to either save them or destroy them. But how do we even begin to understand something like that? They're not human. They're not even really alive in the way we are. Harris closed her eyes for a moment. The weight of the words haunted her. How could they stand against an enemy like that? The Ancients were beings of unimaginable power, ancient beyond comprehension, and now they were offering humanity a choice, one that could end everything. They've been watching us, Dr. Lyon said softly, her voice tinged with fear. For eons, they've been watching us. The Deathworlders, us, all of us. They've seen our growth, our potential. They're not just offering us a choice, Captain. They're testing us. The thought was chilling. The Ancients had watched the galaxy grow, watched its inhabitants evolve, and now, after all this time, they had come to offer a choice, one that would decide whether humanity would live or die. It wasn't just a battle of strength anymore. It was a test of humanity's very soul. Maybe this isn't just about power, Captain Harris whispered, almost to herself. Maybe it's about what we choose to become, what we're willing to sacrifice. The crew remained silent. They were all thinking the same thing. How could they possibly choose? They had to help the Deathworlders, but could they do it at the cost of everything? Could they truly risk everything by siding with an enemy so powerful, so ancient, and so mysterious? The ship groaned as the gravitational pull grew stronger. The Vanguard was now inside the heart of the fortress, floating through a vast and endless void of dark energy. The walls of the fortress were unlike anything they had ever seen, smooth, pulsing with an eerie light that seemed to shimmer in a language they couldn't understand. The energy in the air was thick and charged with something unnatural. This place, Dr. Lyon said, her voice quivering, it feels alive. It's not a ship. It's a living organism. The whole structure, it's like it's breathing. Captain Harris turned to face the science officer. What do you mean? Dr. Lyon swallowed, her eyes wide with disbelief. I don't know how to explain it. It's like the entire fortress is one massive, sentient entity. The energy I'm reading is not just power, it's intelligence. The Ancients are here, Captain. They are alive. The word hung in the air like a heavy fog. The fortress was no mere structure. It was the very heart of the Ancients, and it was alive. And now it had them in its grasp. The voice of the Ancients boomed through the ship's comm system, cutting through the thick silence that had settled over the crew. You have arrived. Now you will understand. The power we offer you is beyond your comprehension. It is a gift. Accept it, and you will wield the strength of the universe itself. Deny it, and you will be erased from existence, just like the others who failed before you. Harris's heart raced as the words reverberated in her chest. The ancients were not just threatening them. They were offering a choice that no one could possibly understand. How could they trust such power? How could they risk everything to accept it? The galaxy, the universe itself, could be reshaped by their decision. "Captain," the tactical officer said, his voice tight, "the Deathworlder fleet is waiting for us. They're in position, but they're not moving. They're waiting for us to make our decision. They trust us. They believe in us." Harris clenched her jaw. The Deathworlders were depending on them. But could they be trusted to make the right choice? Could anyone? The voice of the ancients came again, this time more urgent, more demanding. "You are the last to arrive, Captain Harris. The others have fallen. It is your turn. Choose wisely. Your fate, and the fate of all your kind, rests in your hands." The tension on the bridge was unbearable. Harris could feel every pair of eyes on her. The choice was hers. She had to decide. Accept the ancients' offer and risk everything for unimaginable power, or deny them and risk the destruction of everything she held dear. "No," Harris said suddenly, her voice strong and clear. "We will not be the ancients' pawns. We will not accept this power without understanding it. If they want us to choose, then we will choose to fight for our own destiny. We will fight for our survival, for the Deathworlders, for humanity. We will not let them erase us." A murmur of agreement passed through the crew. They stood behind her. They trusted her. "Get us to the Deathworlder fleet," Harris ordered. "Now." The tactical officer hesitated for a moment before nodding, his fingers moving over the controls. The Vanguard shifted and began to move away from the heart of the ancients, its engines pushing against the fortress's pull. "We're going to fight for our future," Harris whispered to herself, her voice steady, despite the fear that gripped her heart. "We won't let anyone take that away from us." The Vanguard shook violently as it pushed against the powerful gravitational pull of the ancients' fortress. The massive structure loomed ominously behind them, dark and unyielding, like a silent predator watching its prey. Captain Harris felt the ship strain beneath her feet, and she knew there was no turning back. The crew had made their choice. They would fight for their survival, not bow to the ancients. "Status report," Harris ordered, her voice calm but firm. She couldn't afford to show weakness now. "Engines at full power, Captain," the tactical officer replied. "We're pulling away from the ancients' gravitational field, but we still have their energy signature on our scanners. They're watching us, waiting for us to make our next move." The communications officer added, "The Deathworlder fleet is in position, Captain. They're holding their formation, awaiting our orders. They're ready to fight." Harris felt the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. They weren't just fighting for their survival anymore. They were fighting for the future of every living being in the galaxy. The Deathworlders, humanity, the entire universe. They all depended on this moment. "Tell them to prepare for battle," Harris said. "We need to send a message. We will not be controlled. We will not be their slaves." The crew worked quickly, sending the orders to the Deathworlder fleet. The massive ships, battle-hardened and brimming with weaponry, began to position themselves around the Vanguard, forming a formidable defensive perimeter. Harris watched them closely. She could feel the immense power of the fleet, the firepower, the sheer might that would soon face the ancients and their overwhelming forces. But then, the voice of the ancients echoed through the ship again, louder this time, vibrating the very air. "You dare defy us, Captain Harris. You are nothing compared to us. We are the masters of the universe. You are children in the vastness of time. Your power is insignificant." The words hit like a blow to the chest. Harris fought the surge of fear, the temptation to doubt herself. But she couldn't afford to falter now. She couldn't let the ancients dictate their future. "Keep moving forward," Harris said, her voice unwavering. "Activate all weapons. We're not backing down." The bridge was a flurry of activity as the crew prepared the ship for the inevitable clash. The tactical officer called out, "Weapons online, Captain. All systems ready for combat." But just as they prepared to engage, the energy readings spiked. The ancients weren't just sitting back anymore. They were readying themselves to unleash their full power. A massive beam of energy shot out from the heart of the fortress, lighting up the dark space like a sudden sun. "Brace for impact," Harris shouted. The Vanguard shook as the beam collided with the ship's shields. Sparks flew across the bridge, and the lights flickered. The energy hit with the force of a supernova, and for a moment, Harris thought they might not survive. The ship groaned, its hull creaking under the pressure. The shields held, but just barely. "Shields at 30%, Captain," the tactical officer shouted, panic in his voice. "We won't last much longer if they keep this up." "We can't let them take us down," Harris growled. "Prepare to fire. Return fire with everything we've got." The crew activated the ship's weapons, and the Vanguard unleashed a barrage of missiles, plasma bolts, and energy cannons aimed at the source of the ancients' attack. The Deathworlder fleet followed suit, launching their own salvo of weapons in a synchronized strike. But the ancients were prepared. Their fortress pulsed with energy, and as the attacks hit, the beams of light bent and twisted, deflecting the weapons with ease. It was as though the fortress was alive, reshaping itself to absorb the impact. "Their defenses are stronger than anything we've ever encountered," Dr. Lyon shouted from the science station. "We need a new plan."